I want to talk to you today about this whole issue of confronting Caesar's court. How do you stand in front of a political setting that is so tumultuous in our times? Almost every country has experienced a pendular swing from one end to the other. Nobody 10 years ago would have given Narendra Modi a chance of becoming India's prime minister. But not only did he become India's prime minister, he's probably become one of the most powerful prime ministers they have ever had, to a point where a lot of people wonder, is this moving in a direction religiously that is going to make it very difficult for the Christian to truly be a witness there? The same thing happened in France, a totally unexpected person. Canada, and of course, very much here in the United States. The Philippines, Duterte. Almost everyone you talk to said, if you'd asked us a few years ago, this would never have happened. One thing it reminds you and me of that, what Luther said, history is like a drunken man really knocking himself from one wall to the other, ending up senseless, hitting the wall in this extreme, moving to the wall in the other extreme. What that really tells you is that politics has not been the answer, but has always hoped that it will be the answer. And when you end up with in a sense of despair, you wonder if you ought to move to somebody else in another extreme. During the early church, the key figures of the Roman Empire were looming largely over the Jewish state. And they were desperately looking for somebody who could break through the barrier. And God changed history through the conversion of one man. Today I was being interviewed by a journal, by a news magazine, and they began with the comment that Franklin Graham has said, these are very, very dark times. Would you agree? I said, yes. I said, they said, do you have any hope for the future? I gave him my usual line, prophecy is very difficult, especially about the future. But I did say to him, the fact of the matter is, I always like to say there is hope, because if you don't say that, you're not really resting on the possibility that God can do something miraculous and change history. But what I truly believe is that things are going to get much worse before they actually get better, because we're moving at such a high speed, and the faster you are moving, the farther ahead you need to be able to see. And so we are moving at that speed. Think of all that is being done in the Roman road of today. What is the Roman road of today? It's the internet. Think of what is happening with the Greek language of today. What is the Greek language? It's right here on your hip. And if we don't understand the language and the road of our times, we will never be able to get the message or find the pathway in order to get it to people. It's a tumultuous time, it's a nerve-wracking time, and every one of you goes to bed wondering when you wake up, what kind of news are you really going to hear? So much happens so fast. And when you talk about the post-truth society, it has come to a point not so much that people do not believe in the truth, but they really wonder where they can get it. That's the biggest doubt they have. Which source do I go to get the truth, with so much coming at you in so many different directions? So here is young Paul, who's wanting to get to Rome. It was his longing, even though many were warning him that when you get to Rome, it'll be the end of the road for you. Your life will be taken from you. But he was determined to get to Rome, and what happened in his visit to Rome changed all of history. This was the man, of course, who wrote 1/3 of the New Testament for us. And so here he is standing in front of the man whom he's going to truly address. And I want to, Felix particularly, but referring to many others. Let me read the passage for you. Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. When Lysias the commander comes, he said, I will decide your case. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was a Jewess. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. as Paul discoursed on righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. Those are the three things: righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. Felix was afraid and said, "That's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you." At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, so he sent for him frequently and talked with him. Clarence Edward Macartney gives this description of the scene. What a contrast! On the throne sat Felix, the faded and withered pagan. A former slave, he became a favorite of Claudius, and by that emperor was exalted to high rank. Greed, cruelty, and lust were stamped upon his countenance. His administration as procurator of Judea had been marked by injustice, extortion, and violence. By his side sat the lovely Jewess Drusilla, a daughter of Herod Agrippa. She had first married a Gentile who, to please her, had become a Jew. Then Felix, with the aid of a sorcerer's incantations, had won her from her husband and was living with her in sin and shame. All that was dishonorable in mankind was represented by that combination of Felix and Drusilla as they sat on the throne awaiting the address by St. Paul. Before them, with chains on his arms and his body scarred with the marks of his sufferings for Christ's sake, and his coarse garment which his own hands had probably woven, contrasting with the velvet and purple of Felix and his paramour, stood the lonely ambassador for Christ. Think of that scene. Ordinary man, from what history tells us, he wasn't very much of a tall figure. Some people think he had even weakness with his eyes or whatever it was. They guess at all of this. But here he is now, standing in Felix's court. He's coming towards the end of his life. And what Macartney reminds us is this, that he was standing in front of a man with the power of a king, but the mind of a slave. Felix had 3 wives. The first was the granddaughter of Antony and Cleopatra. Drusilla was the daughter of Agrippa, first married to a Syrian petty potentate, and at 16 was lured away by a sorcerer's incantations to marry Felix. So everything that was dishonorable, he's really sitting with a young teenage gal by his side. And Paul has to now present the gospel to him. How does he approach it? I think it is almost impossible to draw parallels between what was happening in Rome and what's happening in our time. If you read Gibbon's The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, you'll begin to recognize very quickly so much was going on in Rome that the difference between right and wrong was not even known. The whole issue of sexuality had degenerated to a point where norms were not there anymore and relativism had taken hold. Abortion was at very, very high levels. Marriage was almost completely desacralized. If you read Alfred Edersheim on his description of Rome at that time, you will see page after page, and the more you read it, you'll ask yourself, is this really that long ago, or is it exactly what is happening in our time as well? Now, when you are in the workforce as you are, or in the world of business, where so much goes on in terms of contracts and finance and understanding and marketing and sales and value and all that stuff, how do you find a point of reference? How do you find a point of reference to interact with people? We were just 2 days ago in Silicon Valley. We had a whole day of interaction with some of the CEOs of the biggest companies out there. If I name many of them, you'll know who they are. But it was fascinating to listen to the struggle that they have in this time with that sophistication and that control of so much of technology. How do you get the name of Christ in a conversation? We were told that if you go to the Bay Area, somebody in San Francisco is really not interested in what's going on in San Jose, and San Jose is not interested in what's going on in the next corridor out there, because it's so vast and so powerful and one of the wealthiest parts of this country per capita. And it was fascinating to listen to 2 men who came from very high levels of very successful companies. And one of them was asked this question: do your employees, with so many thousand of them, know you are a Christian? In fact, Sanj asked that question for him. And the man paused and he said, probably most of them do. I talk about it very openly. Most of them do. They know that I'm a Christian. And here he is, over thousands and thousands of employees. And then another man from an equally sophisticated company said, when they come and ask me to attend a Bible study, I tell them I can't. I'll support you. I'll do anything I can from behind the scenes, but don't expect me to come along and sit in the midst of this, because if I do, I will be seen already as sort of tainted and prejudiced and so on. I'm sorry, I really cannot be there. The culture of each company determines the freedom and the liberty with which you're able to interact and say what it is you need to say for the gospel. So I want to give you 3 ways in which Paul approached this. Number 1, he found a point of reference. The point of reference was going to be dealing with righteousness, moral reasoning. This is sort of the last bastion of the arguments for the existence of God. Once upon a time, you could talk from causality, that everything that came into being could not have caused its own existence. It had to be caused by something outside of itself. At other times, you could argue from design, when you see specified complexity, when you see order, you know that something very specific has been poured and put into it. You don't think a dictionary develops because of an explosion in a printing press. It had to have that specified complexity and points to a mind. These arguments hardly work in any sense on a university campus today. The argument from causality, it's been a long while since I heard any exponent even use it. In fact, my professor, Norman Geisler, probably one of the finest Thomistic scholars of our time, specialized in Thomistic arguments. The whole idea from the unmoved mover, the first cause, all the way down to arguing for why the Judeo-Christian worldview points to that very being. Today, when you start using those arguments, many of them buried in quantum theory and so on, randomness and meaninglessness and all, they just sort of dismiss that. It's fascinating how important it is for us to understand what happened centuries ago. Why was Thomas Aquinas arguing this way? Why was Augustine arguing the way he was in writing about the city of God? We go through all these centuries to come here now, and we gradually dismiss all the learning and all the wisdom from causality to design, purpose, teleology, whatever. But one thing that still comes out constantly in discussion is the moral argument. How do we move from what is to what ought? How do we move from our subjective reasoning of this is okay to know this is not the way it ought to be? You see, when you get a bird's eye view of coming to truth, if you go back from the 16 to the 18 or 1900s, René Descartes in the mid-1600s, rationalism was the big thing. By reason alone, you have to argue by reason alone. It moved him to an extreme where mathematics was the only discipline to which you could be certain, because the assumptions in one way are already in the conclusions. And what Descartes came up with, that the only most certain statement that you can make is that you exist because you think. I think, therefore I am. But technically speaking, he should really have said, I think, therefore thinking exists. What is the I am we're talking about? So from rationalism, we moved to the 1700s of David Hume. David Hume moved towards an empiricism. The scientific method was the only ultimate method. And the philosophical term for truth testing coming out of science was called logical positivism. You moved to this sense of the empirical world is the only real world out there. You cannot make pronouncements on any metaphysical issues, but you can be certain of what the elements do, what happens when you add this to that, and the empirical worldview reigned supreme after the time of people like Hume, and in many, many ways still does. But the question you have to ask the empiricist is this: all right, empirical truth is verifiable truth, testable truth, and therefore you posit statements. My question is this: what gives the scientist the necessity to tell the truth about his findings? What makes it necessary for a man who's doing research or a woman who's doing research to say, when I do this and this and this is what actually develops? Why should they tell us the truth? That is not an imperative extended from the scientific or empirical worldview. That gets into the metaphysical worldview and, if you will, really in the spiritual worldview. In fact, Immanuel Kant, who believed that you could come to an ethical perspective apart from the revelation of God, his fundamental ethic, coming from the categorical imperatives and so on, was always tell the truth. Always tell the truth. But then people started introducing things like this. All right, you've got your wife and children in the back room there, and a man comes in with a blazing gun in front of him, and he says, you tell me where your wife and children are, and I'm going to get them, I'm going to kill them. Do you tell him the truth at that time? All the theories that developed by bringing in exceptions ended up with dying the death of 1,000 qualifications. So you moved from that kind of categorical imperative to utilitarianism, the greatest number of good for the greatest number of people. If you talk to a Muslim in the Middle East and you talk to a Christian in the West, what the two people think is the greatest number of good for the greatest number of greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people be two very different things. You see, a man talking from ISIS might say, the greatest good for my part of the world is to kill everyone who doesn't bend his knee to the God I worship. And the greatest good for the greatest number of people in the world is if somehow you can get rid of the West and get rid of Christianity. They truly and fondly as ideologues believe that. So from the categorical imperative to utilitarianism, you moved ultimately to the writings of Nietzsche in the 19th century. And Nietzsche was born 1844, died in 1900. He was the son of a pastor. He was a grandson of two pastors. Both his maternal and paternal grandparents were actually in the pastorate. So imagine that, raised in a home of true belief in the supernatural, he rejected it all and coined the phrase, God is dead. And he made the comment, since God had died in the 19th century, what games can we invent in the 20th? Because we used a sponge to wipe away the entire horizon. Is there any up or down left? Will we not need lanterns in the morning hours? His metaphors were poignant. And he went on to say, because God had died in the 19th century, the 20th century will become the bloodiest century in history. He was right. In the 20th century, we killed more people in warfare than the previous 19 centuries put together. Acharya Vinoba Bhave, the Indian sage, said, in the pre-modern world, violence would be relative. In the modern world, violence would become an absolute. Now, take that metaphor to the war of ideas, a battle of ideas to gain center stage in our culture. Think of the violence we do to people with words. Think of that. Think of how much laceration goes on for the destruction of somebody. And so you watch the news and you watch all that's going on behind the scenes and you say to yourself, I really don't need to watch this stuff before I go to bed, because I'm going to lie in bed awake all night after listening to all this arguing and all this back and forth. You see why, ladies and gentlemen? The fundamental question of our time is, where do I get my ethics from? Where do I get my ethics from? And the greatest temptation of the Garden of Eden was posed in a very simple question. Has God really said? Has God really spoken? And it is fascinating that in the temptation of our Lord in the wilderness, the interaction was on what God had said. But a text was taken out of its context and became a pretext. And every response of Jesus to the tempter was from the propositional truth, be gone, it is written, be gone, it is written, be gone, it is written. To you and me, the sacred text is the defining text on the nature and the character of God and the imperatives for my life and my living. That's where we come from in this whole issue of righteousness. But that's why Luther struggled with this thing. And as we are about to end the 500th year of the Reformation, Martin Luther at one point almost cursed God, and he said, "It is impossible for me to be a righteous man. I cannot do what you're asking me to do. I've tried." Luther's struggle was not that he was a bad Catholic, but that he was a good one. He struggled with this idea of, how do I find faith? How do I find righteousness? I've toiled, and you sort of up and down, you struggle and struggle, till it dawned on him in that glorious study of the book of Romans that righteousness was not an attainment, it was the gift of the very Son of God, just as faith was in him. You cannot attain it on your own. The righteousness of God comes as a gift and the covering and the internal imperatives to you. And the temptation that stands out to me in the book of Genesis, every time I read it, I go through the scriptures every year. Every time I read those early chapters of the book of Genesis and see violence right in the first 3 chapters there as murder comes into the first family, it all hinged on one question, one command: do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God said, because the day you do it, you're going to die. And the tempter said, no, it's exactly the opposite. The day you do it, you will be as God. The opposite ends of submitting to God or playing God. And what happens when you play God is exactly the kind of world in which we are now living. And Lotz was talking about the fact that we are living in Romans 1. We see ourselves spiraling down, till the heart is shattered and the heart is broken. You know, one of the things I've noticed so much as we've traveled, one of our young men was doing a session in, I think it is either Seattle or Vancouver, somewhere in the Northwest. And he said to me, he said, Ravi, what happened at that conference was so suddenly brought to all of us in a way that we never expected. It was for junior high kids. And this 14-year-old comes to the microphone. And he looks at the panel. My colleagues were on the panel. And he says, I just want to ask one question, and I want your answer to be true. I have just one question. What does my life really mean? He said, I've tried again and again to take my life. I haven't succeeded. Can one of you tell me the truth? What is the meaning of my life? Now, I suspect he's already experienced many things that years ago you'd wait for later years to experience. He's experienced everything. And now he's saying, is this all there is to it? This is what I have to look forward to? The day you and I arrive at the fact that God's commands are meant for our good, and the violation of those commands will end up in destruction, it's one of the greatest triumphs in life to come to. That's why he talks of the law of God being sweeter than the honeycomb. How precious to me are your laws, O Lord.